At the crossroads of East and West, Moldova faces a choice that could reshape its future. Behind the scenes, Moscow is playing a subtle yet powerful card. Faith, Orthodox priests, Russian money, and social media campaigns are stirring a quiet storm. Can Moldova resist Russia's Christian card, or will belief tip the balance in this high-stakes election? Moldova, a small and deeply religious country in Eastern Europe, faces pivotal parliamentary elections on September 28th, a vote that could determine whether the country moves closer to the European Union. Yet, the murmurs in the country are that Russia may be attempting to sway the outcome using one of the oldest weapons in the book, religion. In September 2024, Father Mihai Bichu, a priest in the Orthodox Church in Moldova, and a group of around 36 Moldovan Orthodox priests traveled to Russia on an all-expenses-paid tour of the country's most sacred Orthodox sites. During the trip, they received vouchers worth 10,000 rubles, roughly $120, to spend in church-run souvenir shops, and attended lectures by Russian theologians and historians emphasizing the historical and spiritual bond between Russia and Moldova. The presentations stressed that Moldova and Russia share a common faith and centuries of tradition, while portraying the West as morally corrupt. Observers say the goal was subtle: to strengthen loyalty to Moscow and influence voter sentiment ahead of the elections. The report by Reuters also said that before they flew home, Bichu said he and many others in his group received debit cards issued by a Russian state bank, which were handed to them in a monastery by non-church people whom he couldn't identify. They were told money would be transferred to them soon after they returned to Moldova. Political analysts warn that this kind of religious influence can shape voters' perceptions without explicit coercion. As election day approaches, domestic critics and international observers are watching closely whether the Moldovan electorate resists Moscow's Christian card, or will faith become a decisive factor in one of the country's most consequential votes in decades. Moldova, home to 2.4 million people, remains caught between East and West. Though the country gained independence from Russia in 1991, its Orthodox Church continues to function under the Moscow Patriarchate, giving it significant cultural and social sway, particularly in rural areas and among older citizens. Before returning to Moldova, priests in the group were handed debit cards issued by a Russian state bank at a monastery by unidentified individuals. They were told that funds would be transferred to the cards shortly after arriving home. In exchange for the money, approximately $1,200, each priest was expected to create social media channels for their parishes across Moldova. The task: alert congregants about the perceived risks of the pro-Western government's push for closer integration with the European Union. The arrangement tied financial support directly to Moscow-aligned messaging, turning religious influence into a tool for shaping public opinion ahead of critical elections. The combination of spiritual authority and targeted communication highlights the unusual lengths being used by the Kremlin to sway voters, raising questions about the role of foreign powers in Moldova's political future. In a national address this week, Moldovan President Maia Sandu warned that the Kremlin is spending hundreds of millions of euros in a ploy to buy Moldovans' votes, intoxicate them with disinformation online, and recruit provocateurs to stoke disorder, violence, and fear. He said that they were doing it using religion as a tool of influence. The president warned against the consequences of Moldova falling prey to Russia, especially for the global West.
If Russia gains control over Moldova, the consequences will be immediate and dangerous for the entire region. Every Moldovan will suffer, no matter who they voted for.
Sandu, whose pro-European Union Party of Action and Solidarity is seeking to retain its governing majority. However, there are growing concerns in the party that the Russians are trying to sway the elections towards pro-Russian opposition parties. Sandu was re-elected president in elections last year, but a referendum on the country's EU membership was won by a razor-thin majority, raising questions about Moldova's long-term direction. As per the incumbent president, Moldova is no stranger to Russian meddling. In the 2024 elections, Moldovan authorities said more than 130,000 citizens had been bribed by a Russia-linked network to vote no in the European Union referendum. Valeriu Pasha, chairman of Watchdog, a digital monitoring group in Moldova, says that Russia's tactics of influence have evolved since, but vote buying is still prominent.
They train these people, they indoctrinate them, they pay them. They send them very precise instructions, talking points, and content to be shared on TikTok. It all works in a coordinated way, which helps them to manipulate algorithms on social media, especially TikTok.
2025 parliamentary election in Moldova, nestled between Romania and Ukraine, is critically important because it will determine the country's geopolitical direction, whether it continues its path toward European integration or falls back under Russian influence. The election result could influence regional security dynamics, especially considering Moldova's proximity to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and its role as a buffer state. Ukraine's President, Volodymyr Zelensky, said this week that Moldova needed support to prevent it from coming under Russian influence, a fate that had already befallen Georgia and Belarus.
We have already lost Georgia in Europe. Human rights and the European nature of the state system are only shrinking there. Georgia is dependent on Russia. And for many, many years, Belarus has also been moving toward dependence on Russia. Europe cannot afford to lose Moldova too. It's important to remember how the world once ignored the need to help Georgia after Russia's attack, and how the moment was missed with Belarus. How Moldova must not be lost. And for Europe, supporting Moldova's stability is not costly, but failing to do so will come at a much higher price. That's why the EU needs to help Moldova now with funding and energy support, not just words or political gestures.
Moldova has assumed an outsized role on the diplomatic chessboard because of its proximity to Ukraine and the NATO alliance, via its border with Romania, but also because of its trajectory. In 2021, Moldova elected the pro-European, pro-Western Action and Solidarity Party of President Maia Sandu with a healthy majority. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Moldova applied for EU membership, secured candidate status in record time, and now hopes to join the Union by 2030. Both polls were marked by accusations of Russian interference, including a massive voter bribery scheme, said to have been orchestrated by a pro-Russian proxy, where $15 million was alleged to have been transferred to 130,000 Moldovans, about 10% of the active electorate. Now polls suggest Sandu's party faces a serious challenge from pro-Russian opposition parties that could deny her a parliamentary majority. Without a solid majority, the government may struggle to complete demanding economic and political reforms to join the EU, while it continues to grapple with entrenched poverty, stubbornly high inflation, and relatively large numbers of Ukrainian refugees. Sandu has argued that a Moscow-friendly government would be used as a launchpad for hybrid attacks on the EU, an argument European leaders seem to endorse. On a highly symbolic visit to Chișinău last month, alongside the leaders of France and Germany, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk echoed the same fears. The election thus represents a crucial battleground for the broader geopolitical contest between Western integration and Russian influence in Eastern Europe. At the center of the polls is President Maia Sandu, the Harvard-educated reformer who leads the pro-European PAR party, backed by Prime Minister Doran Rusian. They face their main rival, the Patriotic Bloc, led by former President Igor Dodon, and other pro-Russian figures who argue that EU integration threatens Moldova's sovereignty. But smaller players may decide the outcome. The Alternative Bloc, led by Chișinău Mayor Alexandru Stoianoglu, appeals to disillusioned centrists, though critics see it as a spoiler-draining pro-EU votes. The populist R party, under former Mayor Renato Usatiai, adds another wildcard with its anti-establishment stance. Notably absent are candidates linked to fugitive oligarch Ilan Shor, convicted of massive fraud, though his shadow still looms. With the race tight, Moldova's European future hangs in the balance.